Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, John Haynes, A Conversation with Death. The man who rules the world and the angel of darkness take on a horde of demons in this inaugural John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, A Conversation with Death for 99 cents on Kindle or in paperback today. It seems like a day doesn't pass where a so-called comic pro says or does something that winds up alienating not only comic fans, but many of the casual readers out there who might possibly want to get interested in comics and find out what's great about them. And recently, Batman writer Tom King made a statement that was so offensive it could be considered elitist. And this statement that he made on Twitter went like this. He said that comics aren't for everyone, and they're created by the children of immigrants. It's the medium of the outsider and the outcast and the nerd who won't fit in. Now, I'm going to deconstruct that statement because I know that that statement isn't true because I've studied the history of the American comic book, and as someone who has studied the history of the American comic book, I can tell you that comics are for everyone. Now, your American comic book evolved out of pulp fiction, which was an incredibly popular genre in the early to mid 1930s, because the pulp fiction was the predecessor to the American comic book. Pulp fiction featured heroes like Doc Savage and The Shadow, and it was that pulp fiction that sold millions of copies that led to the evolution of the superhero comic book. Now, while the superhero comic book was a popular genre in the 1930s, it wasn't the only genre of comic book to come out of the 1930s. No, there were romance comics, there were war comics, there were horror comics, and there were crime comics. And all of these comic book genres led to the golden age of comics, and during that era, a reader could find any comic that they wanted in any genre that they wanted. And these comics sold millions of copies across the country. But your Tom King believes that comics aren't for everyone, but there is factual evidence that shows historically comics have always been for everyone. Even in the days of the comic book industry's first collapse in the 1950s, comics have always been for everyone. Even when your Dr. Frederick Wortham published Seduction of the Innocent and they had the congressional hearings, there were comics in numerous genres all across the publishing spectrum, and there were still millions of readers buying comic books, not only, again, in the superhero genre, they were buying them in the romance genre, they were buying them in the cartoon genre, they were buying them in the crime genre. However, after the Seduction of the Innocent and the Comics Code, we saw several publishers who published horror comics like EC Comics go out of business, and we also saw a lot of toning down of what would be considered suggestive themes in many comics. So we still had the infrastructure to publish comics in the 1950s, and the industry was still publishing comics for everyone. And the reason why they were publishing it for everyone, because not only children were buying comics, but we had women buying comics, we had men buying comics, and they were the ones who primarily drove the sales for comics, because romance comics, which many people pan and criticize these days, what many people don't know is that romance comics were a huge business for publishers like Marvel and DC. And in fact, Marvel and DC sold more romance comics than superhero comics for years. And war comics were also a big genre for publishers, and they sold a lot of more war comics than superhero comics. And these two genres, a lot of superhero comic fans, they criticized them and panned them, but these were the bread and butter for many comic publishers during the Golden Age and even up until the mid to late 1970s. This is how many publishers made their money, was primarily on war comics, romance comics, cartoon comics, teen comics, they really couldn't publish the crime and horror comics, but the crime and horror comics were also very popular. So there were comics for everyone up until about the mid 1970s. Now, in the mid 1970s, that's when we started to see a lot of publishers walking away from a lot of the genre comics to primarily focus on superhero comics. And that's where I believe your Tom King gets this idea that the comics were created by the children of immigrants and they're the medium of the outsider and the outcast. And the whole argument about comics being the medium of the outsider and the outcast, I believe that comes from the idea that of the 1970s collector. Because the 1970s, that's when we started to see people really starting to think of collecting as a business. Before the mid 1970s, most people just saw comics as something you casually bought. If you bought a comic, or when you were at a train station or a bus station and you were getting ready to go somewhere, you just bought the comic, read it on the train, read it on the bus, and that was it if you were an adult. And if you were a kid, you bought comics to go when you're traveling on a bus or a plane or a train. Or if you had some money your parents gave you an allowance, you went out here and you bought a comic. And that was pretty much how most kids bought their comics. It's just like Diversity in Comics talked about, you know, when you would go to the 7-Eleven and you ride your bike, you just go to the store and buy your comics. Because I remember being 9, 10 years old, I wasn't really serious about collecting like my brother was. I had characters I liked. I liked Iron Man, and I liked other superhero characters like Captain America or the Avengers. And if there was an Avengers comic there or a Power Man comic there, I bought that Power Man comic, but I wasn't thinking about, you know, getting into it and buying comics in a serial basis. And most people weren't really thinking about it until Superman the motion picture came around in like 1978. Now, 1978, Superman the motion picture, that was really what led to a lot of people really getting serious about collecting, because we had this movie and people were looking for the first appearance of Superman, first appearance of Batman, and that's when a lot of the Golden Age comics really started to become valuable, because there was a demand for them and they were very scarce. So there weren't that many copies that survived the paper drives of World War II, or just moms throwing them out, because that's what led to there being this whole industry where we had people really getting serious about collecting. But before them, comics were disposable escapism. People bought them for 10 cents, read them, and then if they didn't care, they just threw them away, or they just, you know, threw them in a box somewhere and forgot all about them. That's just how people saw comic books, and people, again, bought them in various genres, and the ones that became really valuable are the ones that have the highest demand. Now, again, your Tom King is coming from the perspective of someone who really does not understand the entire history of comic books or the history of the comic book medium. I've studied comic books, I've studied the medium, and I can tell you that it didn't become a medium of outsiders and outcasts until the mid 1970s and the early 1980s. Before then, we had many people who went out here and wrote comics, and no one was ashamed of it. I mean, you had the writer of Mike Hammer, Mickey Spillane, who wrote a comic, and you had many other professional writers who went out here and wrote comics. So it wasn't a medium of outsiders and outcasts. It was a business, and many publishers, they treated it like a professional business. Again, it didn't become the medium of outsiders and so-called outcasts and nerds who didn't fit in until the mid 1970s and the early 1980s, when we had all of these collectors coming in, and they were looking to collect these comics, and they were looking to just get into them for a investment purpose. They were looking to collect it as a hobby, and they were looking to turn it into some sort of business venture. But before then, there really wasn't a business venture. It was just something people did, and if they liked the story, they read a story. If they liked the story arc, they read a story arc. But
it was the early 1980s where we started to see this medium starting to become some sort of medium for outsiders and outcasts. And we that's when we started to really start to see the seeds of that. But again, we didn't really see that even in a lot of the 1980s, because if you look at a lot of the comics in the early 1980s, yes, there was a lot of focus on superheroes, but there were also focused on genre comics, because that's how, again, a lot of publishers made their money. So again, comics have always been for everyone, and it really didn't, again, start becoming for smaller groups until the establishment of the direct market in the early 1980s, because the early 1980s, what they wanted to do with the direct market was they wanted to be able to sell comics to niche groups and small audiences, and they wanted to minimize their losses on those comics for second and third tier characters, because the newsstand business, you really couldn't really put some of these books out there because they just wouldn't sell, because you take huge losses on them. But on the direct market, you could do a book like a Dazzler #1 because you could minimize your risk on it, because that was one of the big books of the direct market, was Dazzler #1, and that primarily sold because it was tailored for comic shops, and it was tailored to create that direct market where the publisher could sell directly to the store, and it could minimize its loss to that publisher as a publisher. Because if you could not really sell a Dazzler to a newsstand, you could only sell it in a place like a comic shop. But this is what led to the idea of it being an outcast thing, because the industry, instead of staying with the newsstands and staying with the grocery stores and the drug stores and the supermarkets, it just became more and more insular, and it began to go inside of itself instead of trying to look for ways to try to reach new readers. And that's why the industry is in the state it's in right now, because it's more about creating comics for the direct market than the casual reader. And the reason why they want to continue creating comics for a smaller and smaller audience is because they don't want to answer to that audience, because there's certain content that mothers are not going to give their sons, like people being decapitated, people being eviscerated, people being sexually assaulted, people being murdered in gory and graphic fashion. You're not going to be able to sell that comic on a newsstand or a spinner rack in a Target or a Walmart, because those conservative mothers, they're not going to let their kids read that kind of content. And if you do publish that type of content, you're going to get major resistance from those parents. So that was another reason why many of these publishers went to the direct market. The other reason why they went to the direct market is because we had after the speculator boom of the late 80s, we had this contraction in the 1990s. And that's where we got it becoming more and more insular. But again, comics were never for a small group of people. They've always been for everyone. And readers of all ages have always been able to find comics that suited their interests and their likes. And they still find them, but they just don't find them in the superhero genre, because the superhero genre is just one of many, but many people, they just think of comics and only correlate it with superheroes. But American comics have always created comics for readers of all ages and readers of all age groups. But the reason why the industry is shrinking is this whole notion from creators like Tom King that comics aren't for everyone. They're just for a small group of people. But any smart publisher will tell you that comics have always been for everyone. Readers of all ages and all age groups can find comics. I mean, people find comics every day, whether it be a web comic or a manga or a self-published indie comic. They're finding comics, but the problem is the big publishers just aren't publishing what readers want. And this small group of outsiders, they don't know how to make the business of comics work, because they don't know how to make comics that are relatable or identifiable to readers out there, so that they can see a character they can relate to They can see a character who has their experiences and a character whose stories relate to their lives. And that's why a lot of these comics by guys like Tom King barely sell 50,000 copies, because they only tell stories that barely 50,000 people can relate to. Whereas a person who has life experience, they can tell you a story that relates to 5 million people and then get 5 million copies of a book sold. And that's the reason why they can do that, is because they're making a story that everybody can relate to, everybody can see themselves in, and everybody can see their experiences in. And that story can help that person escape their lives and then come back with a solution for their lives they can apply to their lives. When it comes down to superheroes, they aren't outcasts, they aren't nerds, they are people just like you and me, and comic book characters are just are people like you and me. And that's when I write stories, that's the approach I use when I tell stories, is I want people to be able to see themselves in that character. I want them to see themselves in that character's experience, and I want them to come out of the story learning something they can apply to their own lives, because everybody out here, we're all different. We're not outcasts, we're just people. And that's the thing that a lot of comic writers, they are missing in their stories, is they're not trying to find a way to make these characters people like you and me. They want to make them outsiders, outcasts, people who won't fit in. But America is a country of people who were the people who just wanted to make a life for themselves because they had a hard time in other countries. That was what the immigrants of the early 20th century were. They were people, they wanted to make a living, they wanted to get a start, they wanted to be a part of America, and they wanted to be a part of a great country. And the comic book industry, sadly, has walked away from those roots and those core values of America, and it's just become this elitist group of people who believe that they are better than everyone, smarter than everyone, and they use the comic book medium to talk down to everyone. And they say that the comics that they make are just for themselves. And what they don't see, the irony is that you're making comics just for you, but then you want other people to go out here and buy your comics. And I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. If you say comics aren't for everyone, one of the consequences of that is you're not going to have good sales. And this is what your Tom King doesn't understand about comics. Comics have to be for everyone because publishing is a business. And in business, you want to reach the most customers possible. And that's why people go out of their way to write different types of stories about different experiences. And they make the comic story relatable and identifiable to everyone. I know when I go out here and I write books like the ISIS series, I'm not just writing a story just for black readers. I write stories so that people can see how a girl relates to life. And I get readers who aren't just black readers. I have white readers, I have Hispanic readers, I have Asian readers. I have readers all over this world, and they relate to the ISIS character, they relate to the E-Steam character, and they relate to the John Haynes character and characters like Matilda Crowley because they see themselves in the story, they see themselves in the experience, they relate to the character, and because they relate to the character, they see solutions for their own life, or they become entertained by the story and they enjoy the story because they see something in that character that they could possibly see in themselves. So when I write stories, I write them for everyone, even though my mission is about creating positive stories about black people and the black experience. I still want readers of all ages and all races to experience my stories so that they can learn from the characters and learn from their stories, because I believe that stories are for everyone. And comics, again, the medium I grew up with ever since I was 4 years old, it's a medium for everyone. It's something that people have always found a great story in, and people these days sadly can't find a story because many of the creators, they're caught up in this whole elitism that it's just for a small group. But no, comics have never been just for a small group. As I see it, comic books have been America's mythology, it is America's art form, and it is an essential part of American culture. And what's keeping this piece of American culture from growing are creators like your Tom King who have this view that comics aren't for everyone and they want to turn it into a medium for elitists so they can push their social justice and identity politics agendas, and they're not about crafting great stories about how people live today, people's life experiences of today, or things people relate to today. As a writer, when I write, I want to make stories that relate to the experiences of people today, the lives that people have today, and give them that snapshot of life in this time so they can understand how people live today and how they were entertained by mediums like comics. I want to be able to pass this hobby on to the next generation, and I want to see this medium survive, because the only way this medium will be able to survive is if comics are for everyone, because if comics are for everyone, everyone has an incentive to go out here and buy those comics, share those comics with their friends and family, and see them as the great storytelling medium they actually are. If you'd like to pick up some of my SJS Direct books like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spencerella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.